Why the barracks was built, the Cavalry Barracks was built where it was built, it had some strategic value, I presume. But for me, what's fascinating about is the area, and the reason it was built there was the English's business. But for me, that area there is very, very old. How old is it? Well, the old Irish name for it is Faha. And Faha was a common area, a green area. And if you go back to the old books, ancient books from the time of the medieval period, that area was always in English as a common green. That was a green area that was used for recreation purpose. And in the Irish language, the word Faha means exactly that. Now, why was it called Faha? It must have been associated with a very high status house in the area or family. Like, the Irish didn't have cities, they had homesteads. And the Irish name for a homestead is Ballia. Now, in the modern context, a Ballia would be a village, big village, or indeed a town. But in the ancient context, it was just a homestead, a group of families living together. But because the Faha was there, it must have been associated with a high status chieftain. What were the names? Gone. We don't know at this stage. So the Faha went the whole way from where the barracks was, right along what's now known as Barrack Street. Now, if you get down to the end of Barrack Street, you'll see a very unusual name on the wall. It's called Long Course. And why was it called Long Course? Because it was used for archery practice. It was a very, very straight area, and they had the long bows. Now, these long bows would have been very high, and the Welsh in particular were expert. These long bows were extremely difficult to pull back, so you needed a lot of space to shoot these arrows and these bows, and that's why it was called Long Course. There was another place that the other barracks, the barracks we're talking about was the Cavalry Barracks. There was another barracks down in the middle of Barrack Street that was known as just the Military Barracks, that was built on the original short course. And why was it called short course? Because the short bows, a smaller bow that people would have used, and what was called there was the archery butts. Now, these were essentially bales of straw or whatever that people would use, and they'd have their target and the target practice. So we know that that's there. But isn't it great? It has still have names associated going back to the 12th and 1300s. That, people in Waterford went up to the archery butts to practice on the bows. So it had even a military relevance even back in the medieval period.
Last year during the COVID-19, I was delighted to see that there was a new community garden being developed locally. So I went down for a look and had a chat and decided to get involved. The first thing that I was interested to find out is what kind of surface there was, because this was part of the old military barracks. So I did some research. I work for the library service, so I would have researched a few things in the past. So I started by contacting the military archives, and I got a plan of the barracks, which then really led me on a whole adventure to find out more. I was then delighted to find photographs on the National Library's website, which were part of the Poole collection. The Poole Photography Studio was in Waterford from the 1880s until 1954, and they took lots of photos of the southeast of Ireland and also lots of Waterford city and county, and lots of portraits. So these are on the National Library's website, and so the more I dug, the more I found. So the whole thing has got to be much bigger than and much more information than I ever thought I would find. So I hope you enjoy a closer look at some of these photos and the map of the barracks to give you a flavour of history, a bit of the history of the barracks and what went on there. The majority of the images we're going to see are from the Poole collection. The family firm A.H. Poole was a commercial photographer in Waterford between 1884 and 1954. The collection is held by the National Library of Ireland and contains over 60,000 images. Poole was commissioned to produce images but also took photos spontaneously. His studio was at 34 The Mall and is shown here in a photograph taken in 1910. This image is of a typical photographer of the time period. Barracks was located in what is now known as St Carthage's Avenue, which is shown here in the middle of the map. This is Barrack Street along here and Cannon Street at this end, and then opposite Morrison's Road, and down the side we have Blake's Lane, and then across here is Hennessy's Road, and then Bunkers Hill. So this area, as I said, was St Carthage's Avenue, is where the barracks was located. So I'm going to show you a map from the turn of the century which has the barracks marked on it. Okay, so as you can see, the layout obviously is very similar. Barrack Street here, Morrison's Road there, Cannon Street along here, Blake's Lane, Hennessy's Road and Manor Hill. And here we have the barracks. So as you can see, the main walls along here, and then just sliding up this way to the main structure here, and the main gate, which was facing onto Morrison's Road.
Also, what's very interesting about the area is the lanes that go off it. Now, one of the streets or the lanes that went off it is called Hennessy's Road. Nobody knows who Hennessy was. We haven't got a clue, but it's a very, very, very old name, Hennessy, and it's an Irish name. Coming up from Hennessy's Road, that would connect Hennessy's Road up, we say, Barrack Street. There's a lane called Blake's Lane. Why is it called Blake's Lane? Because down in that lane was a fellow called Blake, I think his name was Andrew Blake, and he made sails for ships. He was a sailmaker, and that's why. So the name became Blake's Lane. That was very common in Waterford. You will find lots of names called Welch's Lane, O'Brien's Lane, and it was always associated with three things I should say, either the owner of the property, the man who collected the rent, or perhaps a shop or something on the lane that the lane became associated with. Then we have Cannon Street. Cannon Street is an obvious reference to the Cavalry Barracks and the cannon guns that they would have had there. Now, so how did all this thing happen up there on Barrack Street and up as far as the concourse? Where did they get the land from? They got it from Mr. Wise. Who were the Wises? The Wises were a very, very well-known family in Waterford, and there's still loads of people here in Waterford by the name of Wise. But the Wises we were speaking about, they were great friends with Henry VIII, King of England. And when Henry VIII, the King of England, suppressed all the monasteries, that means he threw all the monks out and he grabbed all the land for himself. His idea was he wanted money. So he sold the land, maybe rented the land, and he gave the land from St. John's Priory, which stands down, and I had to put a modern relevance on it, where Mason's nightclub is there now. It used to be Club LA years ago. At the back of that is a ruin of an old church that dates from around 1185. And they got all that land off of Henry VIII. That stretched from there, we'd know it as a car stand, right out as far as where Rowan House, this Duggan House, or Rowan was at the Manor of St. John. So the reason it's called the Manor of St. John is because it was the Priory of St. John. So that's the reason. The other barracks was also leased. Now these, to the best of my knowledge, these weren't, the Wises never sold any of their land, very rarely, and that was all leased. So the whole way along from Barrack Street on both sides, out as far as the Manor of St. John, belonged to the Wise family.
It's wonderful to be here in this absolutely beautiful garden. What work has been done here in just off St. Carthage's Avenue against the wall of the old Artillery Barrack. I suppose to start with the St. Carthage's Avenue itself, it's just off what we now know as Barrack Street, which was another barrack further down the street, Barrack Street. But Barrack Street used to be known as Course of Fada. In other words, it was the place where they had the long course, and that's where they practiced archery in the Middle Ages. St. Carthage Avenue, I'm afraid, is a bit newer than that. It was only built in 1938 by the Waterford Council as part of a big housing programme in the 1930s. And interesting from my personal point of view is that my grandparents lived in 6 St. Carthage Avenue, just across the road here from the entrance to this absolutely wonderful garden. The avenue was called after St. Carthage, a 7th century saint from Lismore. He was a Kerryman, and he came to Lismore and set up a college there, or a centre of education. Of course, this was the time when Ireland was the country of saints and scholars, and this is the time of all the great manuscript writing, and there was a great revival of that in the 1930s under the De Valera government of interest in those matters. And that's a revival, I suppose, that started back in the 19th century, but certainly continued well into the 20th century. The barracks here is interesting. It was built it's a British Army barracks, obviously, an artillery barracks, built in 1805, and of course this was at the height of the power of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was hugely successful in Europe, and it's slightly ironic that the land to build this, all of this land here, of course, was part of the land of the Manor of St. John, which is down below us now where the WIT have their music school, at the end of what we call Manor Hill or Bunkers Hill here in Waterford. And Bunkers Hill or Manor Hill is called after, of course, the Manor of St. John, which belonged to the Wise family. And the Wises leased this piece of land to the British government to build the artillery barrack, of course, to repel Napoleon. And the man who leased it, his name was Thomas Wise, otherwise known as Gentle Thomas. And Thomas had a son, also called Thomas, and that Thomas was one of the great supporters and one of the great protagonists of the cause for Catholic emancipation, and it was he who came up with the idea of electing liberal Protestant landlords for Catholic emancipation, and he worked a lot with Daniel O'Connell. And I suppose the interesting part is that he ended up marrying Napoleon's niece, Letitia Bonaparte, and they lived in the Manor of St. John for a while before the marriage broke up out at Lisduggan. So it's a little bit ironic that his father should lease this land to the British Army to build a barracks to help train men to fight Napoleon, and his son ended up marrying Napoleon's niece. So it's a wonderful history to this little part of Waterford, and I think what's happened here in the garden is quite phenomenal. It's wonderful to see not just the beautiful plants here and the respect for nature, but also to see the chickens and the laying hens here. It's a wonderful little piece of greenery in the middle of a city.
My name is James Doherty, and we're here at would have been the perimeter of Waterford Cavalry Barracks, later the Waterford Artillery Barracks. The land is the property of the British Army and will be marked by these stones, OB for Ordnance Board. And this basically meant that once you pass this point, you're on property belonging to the British Army and in turn the British Empire. This will be a common feature of military barracks all throughout Ireland in the 18th and 19th century. So directly behind me we have the houses of Carthage Avenue, built by Waterford Corporation in the 1930s. This shows the original orientation of the barracks. The front entrance, the main gate, would be just behind me. So the barracks was in a square shape. As I'm standing directly behind me, you have the main front entrance into the Cavalry Barracks, which later on becomes the Artillery Barracks.
This is the barracks gateway, quite an imposing structure, not surprisingly, for military barracks. Above the main gate, there's the crest of the Royal Artillery with showing cannons and some cannonballs. And then as you come down, you can just about make out the gate on the left-hand side of the arch. And underneath you can see the cobbled surface. And the right-hand side, you can see there's an opening for a door, which looks like it has a wooden door. But on the left, even though the same shape and outline is there, there actually isn't a door. But what I really like about this photograph is that when you zoom in a bit closer, you can see that the soldiers are messing about on the steps and they're looking out at the top windows because they obviously know there's a picture being taken. But so that's really fun because that's not what you expect from a photo of a military barracks gate. This image taken in 1901 is of the barracks yard showing the main barracks buildings. It's divided into separate blocks, each with their own entrance. Based on information in a 1913 barracks plan, we know what each of the buildings is. From the left, there's a gun shed with a cannon in front. Next is one of the married quarters, and notice the lace curtains on the window. Block A, which entrances to the left, which we can't really see. Block B is the officers' mess. Block C is the soldiers' quarters, and again we can see curious soldiers looking out the windows of this part of the building. Block D was the sergeant's mess, and again curtains can be seen on the windows. The room on the right was a reading room, and it also had a bar. And Block E, which again we can't really see, is was entrances around the corner, were officers' quarters. The low building behind is the stables. In front of it we can see a cart with some hay. The 1913 plan showed 56 men, 5 of whom were married, in the barracks, along with 66 horses. There was a basement which housed kitchens and a canteen, and it can be seen behind the pillars and the railing. In the front left of the image, cobbles can be seen, which have been arranged in such a way as to provide a surface water channel. The morning parade would have taken place in this yard. This image was taken between 1890 and 1910, is of Captain Molyneux and his soldiers. You can see the barracks gate in the background. Outside the gate are the houses at what we now call Norris's Corner, and the houses on Morrison's Road can also be seen. Mr. Poole had a busy day at the barracks on the January 21st, 1901, as the following 4 images were all taken on that day. The first one shows a group of officers and soldiers. You can just about see the cannon with the man left and right leaning on the barrels of it. And again, we have the curious soldiers at the window above. This next image is then a group of reserve men, again with the cannon in front of D block, and the soldier at the back is holding the barracks dog. The next picture is also an officer group in front of the officers' mess. And in this picture, because there's less people in it, you can get a really good sense of what the cannons actually looked like at that time. And final picture then is of Lieutenant King, which is also taken outside the officers' mess. In 1850 and 1851, the Waterford newspaper published poetry written by Henry E. Green of the 17th Lancers, who was based at the barracks.
I am thinking of thee when the grey dawn is chasing the clouds that enwrapped us in gloom. When the sun, like a painter, the canvas adorning, spreads the earth with a carpet of verdure. When the birds with a joyous song outward are flying, when the flowers with their fragrance yield food for the bee, when the zephyr in measured tones softly is sighing, oh then, my love, I am thinking of thee when the tired world slumbers, when the lamp of the student alone shed its light, when the clock in the turret the midnight hour numbers, and the stars throw their charm o'er the beautiful night. And the sentry's quick challenge from the post to post ringing tell the guards are approaching, a warning to me. yet the heart to its haunts like a wilful child cling. Oh then, beloved Annie, I am thinking of thee.
So we've moved around to what would have been the rear of the barracks. We've come down the side, and this is the back of the barracks facing or backing onto the city of Waterford. Okay? Standing in this position, it gives you an idea of the size and the scale of these military compounds. In times of war, they could house hundreds of soldiers, and that's what they were built for, accommodation. There would have been a series of boundary stones all around the perimeter. There would have been a boundary stone clearly marked on the maps in this corner here. Now, it might be somewhere in the undergrowth or may have been removed, but certainly from this angle it gives you a very good idea of the size and the scale of the barracks, which was, as I said, originally Cavalry Barracks and later on the Artillery Barracks. So here we are on the other face of the military barracks, looking down the length of Blake's Lane, and again from this angle it gives an idea of the size of these military compounds. We've come full circle. We're at the bottom of Blake's Lane. You can see the exterior of the original barracks up behind me. And again, this gives us a great idea of the size and scale of the barracks. And over here, if you look over my shoulder, you can see the wall facing down towards the back of the city and the marks of where the city gardens are today.
The question I was asked is like, who lived in those areas? And what you must remember is that up to the 1930s, the housing in Waterford was deplorable. People lived like rats. And I mean that in every way. The conditions were terrible. Even though men had jobs and they had the money to pay good rent, there was no housing available. There was nothing. They lived in what were called tenements, down around the centre of the town and up around Ballybrickin area. And these were absolutely unbelievable hovels, they would have been called, right? And a hovel means someplace very unsatisfactory to live. Now, I remember even when I was young, there was one or two houses that I was aware of up around the area I lived, and I often heard fellas saying, I wouldn't keep a rat in it. The conditions in the house were that bad. That was very, very common. And there was actually a newspaper called the Irish Press, and they started what was called the Slum Crusade in the mid-1930s. And they went around, and indeed in Waterford, and they began to publicise the conditions of the housing in Waterford. And some of the housings were absolutely terrible. If you can imagine a group of houses, maybe 10, 15 houses together, and one toilet for all the people. No bathrooms, no showers, nothing. One toilet that perhaps was broken. And when you flush that toilet, you better run, because we run up the yard after you. That's the way it was. So around the end of the 1930s, they began to build new housing schemes all around the outskirts of the city. St. Carthage's Avenue would have been one of those. And where did the people come from? They came from the lanes, they came from the tenements, and that's who. And so their lives were transformed by getting a beautiful house. Now, I lived in a house not far from the barracks that we had an outside toilet. We didn't have any running water in the house whatsoever. There was a tap on the wall outside, right across from the toilet. And we didn't have a bath. I was washed when I was young, and even my son, who's in his late 40s now, he was also, when he was in my mother's house, washed in a zinc bath in the centre of the floor. So the housing conditions were terrible. And so then up to the late 1930s, they began to build all these houses like Griffith Place, Dominic's Place, Ordinagrania, all those, and people's lives were transformed. It was brilliant that they had houses, but they came from the slums.
So we're now in what is known today as Carthage's Avenue, housing development behind me. All these houses were built on the remains of the old Artillery Barracks in 1933. So again, it gives a good idea of the size and the scale of the barracks, that you can fit all its accommodation into what would have been the grounds of the barracks. So it gives a good idea of the size of it.
This is a studio portrait of Lieutenant Stoney or Storney from the 1880s. We're not 100% sure which barracks he was based at, so whether it was the Artillery Barracks or the Infantry Barracks, but I couldn't resist putting this in because I just think it's a magnificent photograph. So what we do know is most likely the headdress was bearskin, and his jacket would have been a bright red. This is an image from 1899 showing some soldiers and civilians and a dog posed around a cannon. There's an air of informality about the picture, showing some dressed very formally and others less so, indicated by the headwear as much as by the clothes. Judging from this image, moustaches were very common. This picture was colorised by Old Ireland in Colour last year and really brings the photograph to life. This picture shows us a very busy scene at Adelphi Quay in Waterford where soldiers are leaving. This picture was taken around 1914, so they may have been leaving to go to the First World War. Sometimes, in order to make it easier to load the horses via the gangplank onto the boat, the horses were blindfolded, as shown in this picture taken in Dublin in 1922.
Here we are in the top of the city community garden, which basically has been built in a gap between the external barrack wall and the internal barrack wall behind us. And this terrace is just to facilitate the fall down in height from above. Now, the old maps would show on occasion there was cannons mounted here, mainly used for training purposes, not really a defensive feature. The barracks, as I said, isn't really a fortification as such, more of an accommodation block. But over time, at different periods of time, there would have been artillery pieces certainly mounted here. And you can see the great work that's gone into making the garden and what was very much a derelict space. So I suppose give a little bit of the history of the barracks. In the late 1700s, 1796, 1798, you have the threat of French invasion into Ireland. Okay? You also have the United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798, which mainly starts in Wexford, but spreads up towards Waterford into Kilkenny and Wicklow. Okay? This terrifies the English population. Newspapers in Ireland and England carry very lurid, very detailed reports of massacres and thousands of rebel insurgents taken to the hills and mountains of Ireland. So the British Army floods into Ireland. But the problem then is, where do they stay? Right? There's no formal system of barrack accommodation established at that point, and they realise this is a major problem quite quickly. They commandeer large private houses and they have soldiers scattered all throughout the city. This is a very ineffectual way of accommodating soldiers, because if you need them in a time of crisis, you have to go look for them. Okay, so the 1798 experience and the threat of French invasion teaches the British Army one major lesson: they need to have proper barrack accommodation for the increased numbers of soldiers based in Ireland. Okay? So you see a whole programme of barrack building spread throughout the country. Most cities and towns, large towns, get two barracks: infantry and cavalry. Infantrymen tend to be of a lower social class than cavalrymen. They don't want to accommodate them together. This barracks originally was a cavalry barracks. Okay? Construction started around 1802 and was finished about 1803, 1804. It was in use for over 100 years. Right? Now, over time, it turns into an artillery barracks, and to explain that, militia unit was based here in Waterford, and it was the Waterford Infantry Militia. But in the 1850s, a small number of these militia units are given artillery to train with. The designation then changes to artillery. Right? So the Waterford Militia becomes the Waterford Artillery Militia, and this barracks then becomes known as the Waterford Artillery Barracks.
The other thing to say about the soldiers that were in the barracks, you know, an awful lot of them, it was a job for people. It was a job for people. My family would have been always going back as far as I can remember, and would have been on the Republican side. They would have always been of the political view that Ireland should be a free country, unattached from England, and they were involved in that struggle. Yeah, the soldiers would have been. That's pretty modern, if you know what I mean, to say that I'm a Republican. It's not that old. And so going back before that, when there was sort of like a normality in the political the soldiers went around town, they met with the local girls, some of them married the local girls, and they was just part of the city, part of the city.
I suppose the story for me started when I heard that I found out that this was an artillery barracks, and it kind of piqued my interest because I had been researching my grandfather's war history, and this goes back to a time when my cousin had married a woman who was working in the records office in London in Kew, and managed to find my grandfather's war record. I suppose to look back at the story of why he joined in the first place, he was working in America with his brothers, and they had a cargo company. They moved pianos. They lived in the South Bronx in an area called Mott Haven, and at the time that area was famous for producing pianos. There were there were at least 3 major piano manufacturing companies, and they had a job which was a specialist moving company for pianos. At some point in 1915, I think, Redmond, who was a famous Irish nationalist, made the call for Irishmen to join the British Army in defence of the small Catholic nations in Europe. And at the age of 39, it seems, my grandfather answered the call and he came back home. And he came here to Waterford and the barracks here to join the army. And that's where his war story began. It was September 1915. He came here, and after a period of about 6 months, he was posted to the British Expeditionary Force with the 153rd Brigade of the Royal Field Artillery. They were sent to join the 36th Ulster Division in March, I think, of 1916. This was just before the Battle of the Somme. So you can trace the path of his brigade through the war with the war diary. And it seems quite fortuitous for him, actually, that he became quite ill. And his war record says that he was pensioned out of the army due to illness. He had suffered from chronic bronchitis, and this was aggravated, as it says in his record, by active service. And 1 week before the last major German offensive of the war, he was sent back to Athlone, which is why Athlone appears on his record. Athlone was an artillery depot. It was the 5th Division. They had a training depot, and it was a hospital depot. So people who had been injured or who were sick from the artillery would have been sent there, not just Irishmen but Englishmen as well. They would have been sent there to recover, and that's where he was basically retired from the army. And that's where his army story ended. We still couldn't figure out why he ended up in the artillery, and now I'm beginning to realise that it was because of his experience of working with horses, and when he came to the barracks here, they would have recognised that there was a need for people who could work. His actual rank became a gunner shoeing smith, so it meant he was, well, everyone in the artillery was a gunner, but his specialisation, if you like, was a blacksmith. He shoed the horses, and that's something he continued to do after the war.
To go back in history to explain a little bit about what living in the barracks was like, first of all, soldiers didn't tend to stay here very long. The British Army rotated all around the empire. Now the reasons for this are quite complex, but basically they didn't want soldiers setting down roots. They didn't want soldiers becoming too basically entwined or too intermixed with the local population. So if you read old newspapers report from the 1800s, you'll see an article saying, oh, next month the British unit based in the barracks, the 54th Fusiliers, are leaving, and we believe that the Scots borderers are coming and they'll be here for a few months. Okay, so there was never a continuous presence of any one regiment here in Waterford. They would rotate all around the empire as such. Okay, now when they were here, you had separate accommodation, you had married quarters, and you had single men barracks. To get married, you had to have the permission of your commanding officer, because married quarters and marriages present a drain on the unit, a financial cost. So each unit was only allowed a certain amount of married men per unit, okay? And if you did want to get married, if you did meet the love of your life, you could only get married with the permission of your commanding officer, okay? And what would happen is the regiment would stay here for 9 months, a year. They'd be given their orders and they'd be sent, they could be sent anywhere. They could be sent to India, they could be sent back to England, they could be sent to the Americas, wherever they were needed as such. This often created its own, I suppose, issues. When you look at reports, you'd often see the different relationships between different units and the people here in the city. The mayor would often have a farewell dinner for a commanding officer of a certain unit, and at that mayoral speech would say, oh, you know, we got on great with the Scottish borderers, and we believe a Welsh unit was coming next year or next month, and they were here before and the relationship wasn't as good. So the relationship between the people that lived in the city and the units varied. Some of them were quite hostile, some of them were very friendly. I suppose having soldiers in the city was often a double-edged sword. The mayor, the corporation of Waterford wanted the soldiers here, right? Because they spend money. They have accommodation, but what they do, they bring money into the city because they all need to be fed. So they're good for business. Okay? But sometimes they bring their own problems. There was often violent confrontation between men in the city and soldiers. Soldiers are exotic creatures. They've travelled the world. They also have their own accommodation. They're also regularly paid. And this often created friction and tension between young men living in the city. And often you'd see or read of reports of fights or brawls starting, generally over a woman, right, or a woman's affection, because the locals would see the soldiers as, I suppose, having an advantage, and the uniform and having a ready supply of wage and of cash. Okay, so every so often there was friction between different units and the people, and this often broke into trouble, and there was quite some fairly substantial riots here in the city between people and soldiers based in the barracks. The level, I suppose, or the usage of the barracks ebbed and flowed, and it really depended on the security situation within the British Empire. At times of war, at times of conflict, the barracks would be full to capacity. But at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the French army and navy is thoroughly defeated. The whole threat of invasion of Ireland diminishes. So the number of the army, the level of soldiers falls, so the level goes right down. And there was periods in its history where this barracks was completely empty because there's no soldiers or no units nearby to man them. But again, come time of crisis, like the Crimean War in the 1860s, accommodation levels rise again because the empire is now again on a military footing. Okay? Different towns and cities competed to have the barracks headquarters based there. Kilkenny, with the Butler family, the very, very powerful Butler family, always wanted a larger military presence in Kilkenny, because it was good for business. Now, from a military point of view, Waterford is a better location. It's more strategic. It has a major railway connection. It's also a larger port. But throughout history, often Kilkenny had more, I suppose, political influence. So you'd often get a larger detachment of soldiers sent to Kilkenny rather than Waterford. But again, this is all to do with political manoeuvring, and the local politicians wanted the soldiers in the barracks. Now, both barracks were in use at different stages, right up to the War of Independence here in 1919, 1920. Then you have the Civil War, 1922. Right? Both barracks in this stage are severely damaged, mainly through a kind of scorched earth policy adopted by the anti-treaty IRA, Both barracks had been damaged by shelling, but they're also substantially burnt by the retreating anti-treaty IRA in 1922. This particular barracks, and this was only discovered relatively recently, when the anti-treaty IRA forces left in 1922, they placed what would be now known as an IED, an improvised explosive device, under the main gate. This consisted of a large number of artillery shells wired to the gate, and the idea was when the Free State forces would drive into the barracks, they'd open the gate, and this explosive device would take out that column. Now, luckily for the men involved, it never went off. The explosives actually remained hidden and were found by accident in 1933, when behind me what was the Cavalry, later the Artillery Barracks, was turned into social housing, what's known today as St. Carthage's Avenue. I suppose that's just a little history of the barracks that we have behind us. It played a huge role in the history and development of Waterford City for well over 100 years. And there is remains of both the infantry and the Artillery Barracks can be seen today if you walk around like we did earlier on and you know where to look. But mostly, unfortunately, the barracks are gone and have been relegated to history.